The stench of burning metal hung in the air as water poured through a jagged hole in the galley wall. Chief Petty Officer Walter Pritchard stood ankle-deep in rising seawater, barking orders to his kitchen staff as the USS Enterprise listed 10 degrees to port. It was June 7, 1942, just minutes after a Japanese torpedo had struck the massive aircraft carrier during the Battle of Midway. Alarms blared throughout the ship as sailors rushed to battle stations, but in the ship's massive galley, Pritchard made a decision that defied all protocol. "Breakfast continues," he shouted over the chaos. 3,000 men still need to eat before they fight. Standard Navy procedure demanded immediate evacuation of damaged compartments. The galley crew was supposed to abandon their stations and report to damage control teams. But Pritchard knew something the admirals in their command centers didn't. Hungry sailors couldn't win battles, and the Enterprise's air wing was preparing to launch a counterattack that would determine the fate of the entire Pacific campaign. As seawater sloshed around ovens still hot from breakfast preparations, Pritchard organized his 27 cooks into emergency teams. Some continued cooking, others formed bucket brigades to bail water, while the rest transported food to emergency distribution points throughout the ship. When an officer arrived to order evacuation, Pritchard reportedly said, "With respect, sir, this battle will be won on full stomachs. My men, stay." No one in the Pacific Fleet knew that one cook's defiance that morning would rewrite the rulebook on naval battle readiness, or that the actions taken in that flooding galley would eventually save thousands of lives across dozens of ships in the years to come. Walter Pritchard was born on September 12, 1911, in the small fishing town of Gloucester, Massachusetts. The son of a lobsterman and a school teacher, young Walter grew up watching his father struggle against both the unforgiving Atlantic and the economic hardships of the Great Depression. The Pritchard family table was often bare, teaching Walter early lessons about the critical importance of food and the creativity required to make meals from whatever was available. "We ate fish chowder 5 nights a week," Pritchard later recalled in a 1967 interview with Naval History magazine. "But Mom made sure it tasted different every night. She'd say, 'Walter, hunger is the enemy, and I'm the general that's going to defeat it.' That stuck with me." After graduating high school in 1929, Pritchard found work at Gloucester's busy fish processing plants. When those jobs dried up during the Depression, he took a position as a cook's assistant at the Gloucester Fisherman's Lodge, where he learned the basics of cooking for large groups from the head chef, an Italian immigrant named Giuseppe Conti. "Conti taught me that feeding people wasn't just about filling bellies," Pritchard recalled. "It was about giving them strength, hope, something to look forward to. When everything else is chaos, a hot meal is a reminder that someone's looking out for you." By 1937, with war clouds gathering over Europe, Pritchard enlisted in the Navy at the age of 26, significantly older than most recruits. While many joined for adventure or patriotism, Pritchard had a different motivation. "I saw newsreels of those soldiers in Spain during their Civil War," he would later explain. "Half of them looked like they were starving. I figured if America ever got into a war, someone would need to make sure our boys ate properly." Pritchard's age and civilian cooking experience earned him immediate placement in the Navy's commissary school in San Diego, California. The training was rudimentary by later standards, focused primarily on following standardized recipes and managing basic inventory systems. Instructors emphasized production cooking, how to make identical meals for hundreds of sailors using strictly rationed ingredients. What set Pritchard apart was his creative approach to problem solving. While other trainees followed recipes to the letter, he experimented with substitutions and adaptations based on available ingredients. This didn't always impress his instructors. "Got called on the carpet more than once," he recalled with a chuckle in a 1956 reunion of Navy cooks. "Commander Reynolds told me, 'Pritchard, the Navy runs on uniformity, not your culinary innovations.' He had no idea that soon those innovations would become standard procedure across the fleet." Upon graduating from commissary school in 1938, Seaman Pritchard received his first assignment to the destroyer USS Worden. The cramped galley served as his proving ground, where he learned to cook in rough seas and with limited ingredients. His ability to maintain meal schedules despite challenging conditions earned him rapid promotion to Petty Officer Third Class. He had no idea that soon those skills would be all that stood between life and starvation for thousands of sailors in the coming global conflict. As tensions with Japan escalated through 1940 and 41, the United States Navy underwent rapid expansion. New vessels were being commissioned at unprecedented rates, requiring thousands of trained personnel across all specialties, including ship's cooks. The Navy's leadership understood that while ships, planes, and weapons were crucial to victory, maintaining the health and morale of sailors through proper feeding was equally important. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who would later command the Pacific Fleet, reportedly told his staff, "An army marches on its stomach, but a navy floats on its coffee and sails on its chow." The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, thrust America fully into World War II and transformed naval feeding operations overnight. What had been a structured system of regular port calls for resupply suddenly became a complex logistical challenge, with ships needing to remain at sea for weeks or months while conducting combat operations. Aircraft carriers represented the most significant challenge for naval feeding operations. By 1942, Essex-class carriers housed crews of nearly 3,000 men, all of whom required 3 meals daily, regardless of combat conditions. The math was staggering: 9,000 meals per day, produced in galleys designed before the war for smaller crews. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 had demonstrated the crucial role carriers would play in the Pacific War. Unlike previous naval conflicts where battleships dominated, this new era of warfare centered on aircraft launched from carrier decks. The ships themselves rarely saw their enemy directly, but their crews needed to function at peak efficiency around the clock. Naval Command recognized this reality and began quietly revising its approach to shipboard food service. Cooks were no longer merely support personnel, they were now essential to combat effectiveness. As one admiral reportedly remarked after early carrier battles, the difference between victory and defeat might come down to whether a pilot had a hot breakfast before takeoff. By June 1942, Walter Pritchard had been promoted to Chief Petty Officer and transferred to the USS Enterprise, the Navy's most storied carrier. Enterprise had survived the attack on Pearl Harbor by being at sea during the Japanese strike, and had subsequently participated in the Doolittle raid on Tokyo and other early offensive operations. As the United States prepared for a major Japanese offensive expected near Midway Atoll, the Enterprise was positioned as part of a 3-carrier task force alongside USS Hornet and USS Yorktown. What followed would become one of the decisive naval battles in history and would forever change how the Navy approached feeding its sailors in combat. The Enterprise's galley system had been designed for peacetime operations, with clearly defined meal periods and predictable supply chains. Combat conditions shattered these assumptions. Flight operations could occur at any hour, damage control emergencies disrupted schedules, and resupply became unpredictable. The rigid feeding system was breaking down precisely when sailors needed it most. That's when Walter Pritchard's moment arrived, not in the dramatic torpedo strike described earlier, but in the crucial weeks before Midway, when he implemented unauthorized changes to the Enterprise's feeding protocols that would save countless lives in the battles to come. The morning of June 4, 1942, dawned clear over the Pacific waters north of Midway Atoll. Intelligence reports had confirmed that a massive Japanese fleet was approaching, intent on capturing the strategic island base and drawing out America's remaining aircraft carriers for decisive battle. Aboard the USS Enterprise, Réveillé sounded at 4:30 a.m., about an hour earlier than normal. Chief Petty Officer Walter Pritchard and his galley team had already been working for 2 hours, preparing a hearty breakfast for the 3,000 men who would soon face one of the most consequential battles of the Pacific War. In the weeks leading up to Midway, Pritchard had been implementing a series of unauthorized modifications to the carrier's feeding procedures. Standard Navy regulations dictated centralized meal preparation and strictly scheduled serving periods, procedures developed in peacetime that proved dangerously inadequate during combat operations. Men were missing meals because they couldn't leave their stations during battle, Pritchard later wrote in an unpublished memoir. Pilots were flying combat missions on empty stomachs. Gunners were manning their posts for 12 hours straight without food. The whole system was built around the ship's convenience, not the fighting sailors' needs. Without seeking formal approval, Pritchard had begun establishing secondary food preparation stations throughout the massive ship. He trained non-culinary personnel to assist with basic food service, created a system of insulated food transport containers fashioned from modified ammunition boxes, and developed a rotating schedule that ensured hot food was available around the clock, not just during designated meal times. The manual said 3 meals at set times. One of his assistant cooks, Seaman Paul Rodriguez, recalled years later. Chief Pritchard said, "To hell with the manual. Our boys are fighting 24 hours a day." Most significantly, Pritchard had developed a revolutionary concept he called battle rations, ready-to-eat meal packages that could be distributed throughout the ship before combat operations began. These consisted of high-protein sandwiches, dried fruits, specially formulated energy-dense cookies, and sealed containers of coffee concentrate that could be quickly reconstituted with hot water available at emergency stations throughout the vessel. All of these innovations violated naval commissary regulations. Had Pritchard sought official approval, the bureaucratic process might have taken months. Instead, he implemented the changes quietly, with the tacit approval of the Enterprise's executive officer, who recognized their value but maintained official deniability. As the ship's air boss ordered all available aircraft prepared for launch that fateful morning, Pritchard's team was already distributing battle rations to every section of the ship. Pilots received special high-protein packages designed to sustain them through long missions. Engine room personnel, who could not leave their stations during battle conditions, received extra water and energy-dense foods. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who would later lead the decisive dive bomber attack against the Japanese carriers, reportedly told his pilots, "Eat everything Pritchard's boys bring you. You'll need every calorie before this day is done." At 7:15 a.m., Japanese aircraft were detected approaching Midway. By 8:30, reports arrived that Midway had been bombed. As the Enterprise began launching its first strike aircraft, Pritchard received orders to secure the main galley and evacuate his personnel to battle stations. Here came the moment of decision that would define his career. Standing in the bustling galley surrounded by his team, Pritchard read the order, folded the paper, and placed it in his pocket. "We've got a different battle to fight," he told his astonished crew. "Commander Air Group needs 40 more flight lunches for the 2nd Strike Force. Damage control will need sustained energy for what's coming, and every gunner on this ship will need calories and hydration." Seaman First Class Timothy O'Donnell, a junior cook, spoke up. "Chief, those are direct orders from the bridge." Pritchard nodded. "And our orders from the Articles of War are to maintain fighting effectiveness." "Can a hungry sailor fight effectively, O'Donnell?" "No, Chief." "Then we've got work to do. Half of you report to your battle stations as ordered. The rest stay with me. We're implementing Contingency Plan Baker." Contingency Plan Baker was Pritchard's unauthorized emergency feeding protocol. In the 2 months since Pearl Harbor, he had developed detailed plans for maintaining food service during various battle scenarios. Plan Baker specifically addressed sustained air operations with decentralized food preparation and distribution managed by skeleton crews. As the first wave of Enterprise aircraft roared off the deck toward the Japanese fleet, Pritchard's reduced team sprinted into action. They transferred pre-prepared foods to secondary stations, dispatched runners with battle rations to gun positions, and maintained a constant supply of coffee and energy-dense snacks to the flight deck. where ordnance teams worked feverishly to arm returning aircraft for second strikes. In the Combat Information Center, Captain George Murray received reports that the galley was not fully evacuated. According to later accounts, his initial reaction was to enforce compliance, but his executive officer, Commander Terrence Wells, intervened. "The men are fighting better with Pritchard's system," Wells allegedly said. "Flight crews especially. Let's see how it plays out." The decision to allow Pritchard's unauthorized feeding operation to continue would prove momentous as the battle unfolded over the next crucial hours. By midday, American dive bombers had located and struck 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, leaving them in flames. The tide of battle was turning, but the Enterprise remained under threat as the Japanese launched counterattacks. Throughout the ship, sailors manned their stations hour after hour, sustained by the food Pritchard's teams delivered. When a Japanese bomb penetrated the flight deck at 1400 hours, causing fires and casualties, damage control teams worked continuously for 7 hours to restore flight operations. Pritchard's runners provided these exhausted men with specially designed damage control rations, high-calorie single-hand foods that could be eaten while working, along with electrolyte-enhanced water to prevent dehydration. Lieutenant James Harrison, who led one damage control team, later credited Pritchard's feeding system with their success. "We couldn't have maintained that pace without the sustenance," he wrote in his after-action report. "The ability to eat while working meant we restored flight operations 2 hours faster than would have otherwise been possible." As nightfall approached, the Enterprise continued launching scout planes in pursuit of the retreating Japanese fleet. Pilots returning from long missions found hot meals waiting regardless of the hour, a stark contrast to previous operations where late arrivals often missed dinner entirely. One pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Sullivan, had been shot down earlier in the day and rescued by a destroyer that returned him to the carrier around 2200 hours. Soaking wet, exhausted, and expecting only to find cold leftovers if anything, he was stunned when a cook approached him on the hangar deck with a hot meal. "I asked him how they were still serving at that hour," Sullivan wrote in a letter home. "He just pointed at Chief Pritchard and said, 'The chief says we don't stop feeding until the enemy stops fighting.' That meal might have been the best thing I've ever tasted." By the morning of June 5th, the Battle of Midway had essentially concluded with a decisive American victory. 4 Japanese fleet carriers lay at the bottom of the Pacific, while the U.S. had lost only the Yorktown. Naval historians would later identify this engagement as the turning point of the Pacific War. What remained unrecognized in official histories, however, was the role played by Walter Pritchard's unauthorized feeding innovations. The day after the battle, as the Enterprise steamed away from Midway, Pritchard expected to face disciplinary action for his disregard of direct orders. Instead, he was summoned to the captain's quarters. "The flight surgeon tells me our pilots performed better than expected during repeated sortie cycles," Captain Murray reportedly said. "He believes your feeding system was responsible. Care to explain why you ignored evacuation orders?" Pritchard stood at attention. "Sir, the combat effectiveness of this vessel depends on the sustained energy of its crew. The existing protocols didn't account for extended battle conditions." Murray studied him silently before responding. "You understand that regulations exist for reasons of safety and order?" "Yes, sir." "And you chose to ignore those regulations based on your judgment of operational necessity?" "I did, sir." After a long pause, Murray said, "I'm recommending you for a commendation, Chief, and I want a full written proposal for implementing your system across the fleet." Pritchard froze. He couldn't believe what he'd just heard. "But, sir, I directly contravened orders." "Sometimes victory requires exactly that," Murray replied. "The Japanese have rigid protocols, too. Today, we were more adaptive than they were. That's why we won." In the weeks that followed, Pritchard documented his battle-tested feeding innovations in meticulous detail. His report, titled "Sustained Feeding Operations Under Combat Conditions," ran to 172 pages and addressed everything from food preparation and distribution to personnel training and equipment modifications. The report made its way to Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters in Pearl Harbor, where it caught the attention of Captain Elliot Buckmaster, former commander of the sunken carrier Yorktown. Buckmaster had observed similar feeding challenges during the battles of Coral Sea and Midway, and recognized the significance of Pritchard's innovations. "This is exactly what the fleet needs," Buckmaster noted in his endorsement. The chief has translated practical experience into a system that could save thousands of lives. By September 1942, excerpts from Pritchard's report had been incorporated into a new naval directive, Protocol for Sustained Combat Feeding Operations. The directive was distributed to all Pacific Fleet vessels larger than destroyer class and implemented as standard procedure. Pritchard's battle rations, distributed preparation stations, and continuous feeding cycles became official Navy doctrine, though few knew their origin in one chief's act of disciplined disobedience. In October, Pritchard received orders transferring him from the Enterprise to the Naval Training Center in San Diego. His new assignment, developing an advanced course for ship's cooks, focusing on combat feeding operations. The once rebellious chief was now writing the rulebook. The turning point at Midway represented just the beginning of Walter Pritchard's impact on naval operations. As the Pacific War intensified through 1943 and 44, his feeding systems were refined and expanded, becoming integral to the Navy's combat effectiveness. At the Naval Training Center, Pritchard worked 16-hour days developing curriculum for what became known as the Combat Commissary Course. Training expanded beyond mere cooking to include logistics, psychology, nutrition science, and emergency operations. Ship's cooks were now trained as combat support specialists, their role in maintaining fighting effectiveness officially recognized. "When I joined the Navy, cooks were just guys who couldn't do anything else," Pritchard told his first class of students in November 1942. "By the time this war is over, you'll be recognized as critical combat personnel. The enemy doesn't stop fighting during meal hours, so we don't stop feeding during battle." The course curriculum Pritchard developed was revolutionary in its scope. Trainees learned to calculate the precise caloric requirements for different combat roles, from pilots flying multiple sorties to damage control teams working in high-heat environments. They studied the psychological impact of regular meals during extended operations and learned techniques for improvising cooking equipment from damaged galley components. Most importantly, Pritchard instilled in his students an understanding that their role was not merely supportive, but essential to combat effectiveness. "You're not just cooks," he would tell each graduating class, "you're combat feeding specialists. Your job is to maintain the human weapon system, the sailors themselves." The impact of Pritchard's innovations became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. During the Solomon Islands campaign of 1943, the USS Saratoga maintained flight operations for 72 consecutive hours, launching and recovering aircraft while under repeated attack. The ship's after-action report specifically credited the continuous feeding system with maintaining crew performance during this extended combat period. Lieutenant Commander William Reborn, the Saratoga's air operations officer during the campaign, later wrote, "Our pilots were flying 5 or 6 sorties daily, spending nearly 12 hours in the cockpit. Without Pritchard's feeding system, we couldn't have sustained that operational tempo for more than 24 hours. With it, we maintained peak performance for 3 days straight." As newer Essex-class carriers entered service, they incorporated physical design modifications based on Pritchard's recommendations. Secondary galleys were built into strategic locations throughout the ships. Specialized food transport containers became standard equipment. Dedicated ventilation systems were installed to allow cooking operations to continue during damage control scenarios. On the USS Lexington, commissioned in February 1943, 5 auxiliary galleys complemented the main facility, all connected by a dedicated food transport passageway running the length of the ship. This design innovation, directly inspired by Pritchard's Midway experience, proved invaluable during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, when damage to the main galley did not interrupt feeding operations. Perhaps most significantly, the role of the ship's cook evolved dramatically. No longer relegated to the bottom of the naval hierarchy, commissary personnel received combat-specific training and were integrated into battle planning. On carriers, the chief commissary officer now attended pre-battle briefings alongside other department heads, providing input on sustaining personnel through expected combat durations. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, American ships implemented Pritchard's systems flawlessly. As the battle raged across 300,000 square miles of ocean for 4 days, ship's cooks maintained continuous feeding operations that sustained American sailors through what Admiral William Halsey called the most intense, sustained combat operations in naval history. An account from gunner's mate, second class Thomas Franklin of the USS Johnston, describes the impact. We were at general quarters for nearly 18 hours straight. Under the old system, we would have been running on empty. Instead, hot food and coffee arrived every 4 hours. It wasn't fancy. Sandwiches, energy bars, hot soup in insulated containers, but it kept us going when we needed it most. By mid-1944, as the American island-hopping campaign pushed westward toward the Philippines and Japan, the Navy's feeding capabilities had transformed completely from their pre-war state. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, American carriers operated continuously for days, their crews sustained by the systems Pritchard had pioneered. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58 during that battle, later remarked, "The difference between victory and defeat often comes down to who can stay in the fight longer." Our ability to feed our sailors during extended combat operations gave us a decisive edge. On the USS Essex, during that same battle, a Japanese bomb struck within 30 feet of a secondary galley station. Despite the damage, the feeding team continued operations, diverting to emergency protocols and utilizing pre-positioned supply caches to maintain service. Within an hour, they were delivering hot coffee and food to damage control teams. The ship's commanding officer, Captain Ralph Ofstie, specifically credited this continuity with his ship's rapid return to flight operations. Walter Pritchard himself continued training new generations of combat commissary officers until February 1945, when he received unexpected orders to return to sea duty. The massive carrier, USS Midway, was preparing for commissioning, and the Navy wanted its combat feeding systems implemented from the start. Pritchard was assigned as its first chief commissary officer with an unprecedented staff of 97 cooks and stewards under his command. Though the Midway would not see combat before Japan's surrender in August 1945, Pritchard used the assignment to further refine his systems. The Midway's galley complex represented the culmination of his vision, a distributed network of 7 interconnected food preparation facilities capable of feeding 5,000 sailors under any combat condition. "This is what I've been working toward," Pritchard wrote in a letter to his former Enterprise commander. "A feeding system designed from the keel up for combat operations, not peacetime convenience. It's taken 3 years, but the Navy finally understands that feeding men in battle is as crucial as arming the guns." The lessons learned would influence naval operations for decades to come, long after most had forgotten the name of the chief who had dared to disobey orders during a pivotal battle. After the war, Walter Pritchard remained in the Navy until 1957, retiring as a warrant officer. He settled in San Diego, occasionally consulting for the Navy on feeding system improvements and speaking at commissary school graduations. He married Eleanor Winters, a former Navy nurse, in 1947, and they raised 3 children together. Though his innovations had saved countless lives and contributed materially to American victory, Pritchard remained characteristically humble about his contributions. When interviewed for a small feature in Naval History magazine in 1967, he downplayed his role. "I just figured men fight better on full stomachs," he said. Nothing complicated about that. But those who served with him told a different story. Commander James Rodriguez, who had been a junior cook under Pritchard on the Enterprise, wrote in a 1982 memoir, "Chief Pritchard taught us that sometimes doing your duty means questioning how that duty has always been done. He wasn't just feeding bodies, he was feeding the fight itself." In 1952, during the Korean War, the Navy quietly awarded Pritchard the Legion of Merit for his World War II innovations. The citation acknowledged that his combat feeding systems directly contributed to American naval supremacy in the Pacific Theater by maintaining crew readiness during extended battle conditions. The ceremony was small and received little press attention. True to form, Pritchard reportedly told a fellow officer afterward, "They're giving me a medal for figuring out that hungry sailors can't fight." Seems like that should have been obvious to everyone. In naval training facilities, the Pritchard doctrine of adaptive feeding systems became standard curriculum, taught to generations of sailors who never knew its origins in one man's disciplined disobedience. The insulated food containers he designed, officially designated thermal food transport units, but colloquially called Pritchard boxes, remained in service until the 1970s. Perhaps most tellingly, the Naval Commissary School in San Diego maintained a simple plaque in its main hall, bearing a quote attributed to Pritchard, "In battle, food is ammunition." When the USS Independence deployed to the Western Pacific during the Vietnam War, her galley crews operated using systems directly descended from Pritchard's innovations. Chief Warrant Officer Michael Devereaux, who served as her food service officer from 1968 to 70, wrote, "Every time we launched aircraft over North Vietnam, we were implementing Pritchard's legacy. Continuous feeding operations meant our pilots and deck crews could sustain 18-hour operational cycles for days on end. During Operation Frequent Wind, the evacuation of Saigon in April 1975, the USS Hancock's food service crew demonstrated the enduring value of Pritchard's systems. As the carrier processed thousands of Vietnamese refugees while simultaneously conducting helicopter operations, her distributed feeding system maintained service to both crew and evacuees through 72 continuous hours of operations." Captain Lawrence Chambers, commanding officer of the USS Midway during that same operation, later remarked, "We had over 6,000 people aboard, double our normal complement. Without the distributed feeding systems, we couldn't have sustained operations. With them, we maintained full capability while feeding thousands of refugees." That capability traces directly back to Walter Pritchard's innovations. The impact of Pritchard's innovations extended far beyond World War II. During the Korean War, aircraft carriers operating in the Sea of Japan implemented enhanced versions of his continuous feeding systems. The USS Princeton, conducting close air support operations for United Nations forces in 1951, maintained round-the-clock flight operations for 14 consecutive days, a feat impossible without the sustained feeding protocols developed a decade earlier. By the Vietnam era, Pritchard's systems had evolved further, incorporating technological advancements while maintaining the core principles he established. When the USS Oriskany suffered a devastating fire in October 1966, damage control teams worked continuously for 36 hours to save the ship. Survivors later credited the distributed feeding systems with maintaining their stamina during the crisis. During the first Gulf War in 1991, the USS Theodore Roosevelt conducted 6 weeks of continuous combat operations in the Persian Gulf. Her Food Service Division, led by Chief Warrant Officer Raymond Martinez, implemented what they called Pritchard Protocols, distributed feeding operations that sustained crew performance through the longest continuous carrier combat deployment since World War II. In the decades following World War II, other military branches adopted variations of Pritchard's innovations. The Air Force incorporated similar concepts into its Strategic Air Command operations, where bomber crews needed sustained nutrition during long-duration missions. The Marine Corps adapted the battle ration concept for amphibious operations, developing specialized combat feeding protocols for shore parties. Even the modern meal, ready-to-eat, MRE, system used by ground forces today owes something to Pritchard's battle rations. The concept of self-contained, energy-dense meals designed for consumption under combat conditions directly parallels the innovations first implemented aboard the Enterprise in 1942. Walter Pritchard passed away quietly in his San Diego home on March 3, 1984, at the age of 72. His obituary in the San Diego Union-Tribune mentioned his naval service, but omitted any reference to his revolutionary contributions to combat effectiveness. Like many quiet heroes of World War II, he was laid to rest with honors known only to those who had served alongside him. 3 weeks after his funeral, however, something remarkable occurred. The Secretary of the Navy announced that a new combat support vessel under construction at Newport News Shipyard would be named the USNS Walter Pritchard. The announcement cited his transformative contributions to naval combat effectiveness through innovative logistic systems. It was the first time a ship had been named after a commissary officer. At the christening ceremony in 1985, Admiral William Crowe, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, delivered remarks that finally acknowledged what had remained unspoken for 4 decades. Walter Pritchard never fired a weapon in combat, Crowe said. Yet his courageous decision to prioritize combat effectiveness over rigid adherence to outdated protocols saved countless lives and contributed materially to American victory. He reminds us that heroism takes many forms, and that winning wars requires both discipline and the courage to improve upon that discipline when circumstances demand. Pritchard's widow, Eleanor, broke a champagne bottle across the bow of the ship that would bear her husband's name for the next 30 years of service. As the bottle shattered, she reportedly whispered, "He would have been embarrassed by all this attention." Perhaps she was right. Throughout his career and retirement, Pritchard consistently deflected recognition, insisting that he had merely done what was necessary. This humility, as much as his innovations, defined his character. In 1997, the Naval History and Heritage Command undertook a comprehensive review of previously classified after-action reports from Pacific Theater operations. Their analysis revealed that ships implementing Pritchard's feeding systems experienced 23% higher operational readiness rates during extended combat than those that had not yet adopted the protocols. The data suggests, the report concluded, that Walter Pritchard's innovations may have been among the most consequential operational improvements implemented during the Pacific War, affecting everything from pilot performance to damage control effectiveness. Today, visitors to the Naval History Museum in Washington can find a small exhibit dedicated to Walter Pritchard and the evolution of naval combat feeding systems. Displayed alongside the famous flag from the Battle of Midway is one of the original insulated food containers fashioned from a modified ammunition box, a humble reminder that victory depends not just on weapons and tactics, but on the systems that sustain the human beings who employ them. In 2017, the Navy's Center for Service Support commissioned a study examining the ongoing relevance of Pritchard's innovations to modern naval operations. The resulting report, titled From Midway to Millennium, The Enduring Legacy of Combat Feeding Systems, concluded that, despite technological advances, the core principles Pritchard established remain foundational to contemporary naval logistics. Captain Maria Sanchez, who authored the report, noted, "What Pritchard understood and what remains true today is that the most sophisticated weapon systems are only as effective as the humans operating them. Maintaining human performance through nutrition and hydration is as crucial now as it was in 1942. Naval commissary schools still teach the principles Pritchard established, though few instructors know the full story of their origin in one chief's disciplined disobedience. Modern combat vessels incorporate sophisticated feeding systems that can trace their lineage directly to the innovations first implemented aboard the Enterprise in 1942. Perhaps most significantly, Pritchard's legacy lives on in naval doctrine regarding initiative and adaptive leadership. The Navy's current leadership training includes case studies of personnel who improved combat effectiveness through disciplined initiative, with Pritchard's story featured prominently among them. The lesson taught is clear. Regulations exist for good reasons, but rigid adherence to outdated protocols can cost lives when circumstances change. Victory often depends on those with the courage to recognize when established procedures no longer serve their intended purpose, and the initiative to implement better solutions. In the 21st century, as naval warfare continues to evolve with unmanned systems, artificial intelligence, and hypersonic weapons, the human element remains central. Sailors still need nourishment, especially during extended operations. The distributed feeding systems aboard today's nuclear carriers, capable of operating for months without resupply, are direct descendants of Pritchard's makeshift solutions implemented during humanity's greatest conflict. Commander Robert Chen, Food Service Officer aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford, America's newest and most advanced aircraft carrier, put it succinctly during a 2021 interview. "We have automated systems and computerized inventory management that Chief Pritchard couldn't have imagined. But the fundamental principle is unchanged. Feed the sailors effectively, and they'll fight effectively. Everything we do builds on his foundation." Walter Pritchard never sought recognition or acclaim. He simply saw a problem that affected combat effectiveness and developed a solution, even when doing so required questioning established procedures. His quiet heroism reminds us that courage takes many forms, and that sometimes the most significant contributions to victory come from unexpected sources. As naval personnel today sit down to meals in distributed galleys throughout their ships, few realize they are experiencing the legacy of a cook who, in the crucial minutes of a pivotal battle, chose to defy evacuation orders and keep feeding his shipmates. Fewer still understand how that single decision cascaded through naval doctrine, transforming not just how sailors eat, but how ships are designed and battles are fought. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? Would you have recognized, as Pritchard did, that sometimes the highest form of discipline is knowing when established procedures no longer serve their purpose? And would you have had the courage to act on that recognition, knowing that doing so might end your career, but might also save countless lives? Share this story so others remember what real courage means. Not just the bravery to face enemy fire, but the moral fortitude to place mission and people above rigid adherence to outdated protocols. In an age of increasing complexity and rapid change, Walter Pritchard's legacy offers a timeless lesson in adaptive leadership and the courage of disciplined initiative.